Work from anywhere employees. What are they? Why is this create an entirely new issue for employers, for employees? That's what we're going to talk about today before I wrap things up and go for a run. These are questions that have come up over and over, and I want to share with you as an employer, when you've got a remote workforce, when you've got employees working not only out of your city, but out of your state, maybe even out of your country. When you're an employee that's not working in the city anymore, maybe you're working across the river in another state, save a little money, work from home to be safe. There are all types of new regulations and rules and tax consequences, labor requirements, reporting requirements, paperwork that you need to pay attention to. And that's what we're going to talk about today, you guys. The topic is work from anywhere employees, what business owners, what employers, what employees need to know. My name is Mitch Jackson. I'm going to be sharing 34 years of California trial lawyer experience with you during today's show. I want to answer your questions, so use the appropriate box. If you're watching this on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, Periscope, go ahead and ask your questions, hit the share button and share this out. I think we're going to be saving a lot of employers and a lot of employees unnecessary headaches between now and the end of the year, because you have a lot of end of year decisions to make when it comes to where you're living, what you're filing, what you're declaring, both as an employer and as an employee. So I'm going to give you guys some things to think about, some things to talk about. And I do want you guys to know that I am here to answer your questions and hopefully get everybody going in the right direction. So don't be shy, you guys. Hit the button. I'll be checking out all of the incoming questions and answer them if I can. Before we get started, let me first share with you that although I am a California trial lawyer, unfortunately, I'm not your lawyer. Okay, no legal advice is being given. I want to share with you some ideas, some thoughts, some concepts that you need to take back to lawyers in your state, to people in HR in your company, to other professionals in your industry to get answers to these questions. All right. But what I will tell you is the right questions to ask are the right questions to ask. And I'm also going to give you a little bit of guidance. I know I'm going to plant some seeds and get everyone here who's listening. I'm going to give you some new information. This is super important, right? COVID-19's changed everything. A lot of us are working from home, part-time or full-time. Employers are now not only hiring locally, but they're hiring over Zoom. They're hiring employees from different states and different countries. And with this change comes new regulations, new legal interpretations as to state and local income tax and federal income tax filing requirements. With this comes new labor law rules, regulations, and obligations. With this comes new privacy rules and regulations when it comes to engaging with employees on Zoom, when it comes to employees engaging with their employers on the social and digital platforms, right? Just because something's easy doesn't mean it's okay. And I'm getting some great questions, you guys, so keep these questions coming in. So far, most of the questions I'm seeing, I'm planning on answering, so we're in good shape. Once again, let's start with taxes. Let's start with tax liability. Once again, you guys, I'm not a tax expert. I'm just a trial lawyer here in Southern California. No legal advice is being given, all right? But I do want to share a couple of thoughts with you. If you're an employee, let's say you're in the state of California, you're working for a company in the state of California, you're an employee and you live in the state of California, well, then you have one set or type of tax filing and disclosure requirements as the employer and as the employee, right? State income tax filing requirements and things like this. If that California company, if you're the employer and you're working in a company that's located in California, but you've got an employee in Arizona, in Texas, in New York, in Florida, there may be additional tax filing requirements as an employer, and you need to check and make sure you're complying with those tax filing requirements so you don't get hit with unnecessary penalties. If you're an employee living in Florida, but working for a company in California because you are a work from anywhere or remote employee, you need to look at whether or not you have to pay both California state income tax and Florida state income tax. You need to check on what type of other tax filings are required, because there may be some additional requirements if you're an employee living in one state but working for a company in another state. Each state is different. And right now with COVID-19, the federal government is rolling out new rules and regulations to make it easier for people to comply with tax responsibilities, or even waiving certain penalties in certain double taxation situations so that you're not taxed twice on your income. This is important stuff, you guys. So let's pay attention and we'll get through this together. The withholdings and paperwork requirements, and by the way, I've got some notes here I'm going to be referring to. They do change whether you're an in-state employee or an out-of-state employee. If you're working from a different country for a company here in the United States, both the employer and the employee need to make sure that you're filing all the appropriate and necessary tax paperwork with respect to that out-of-country employee. You'll also need to make sure you're, as in a company, withholding the appropriate amount from payroll that would otherwise be dispersed to that out-of-state or out-of-country employee. Critically important, you guys cross your T's and dot your I's. There's a thing called Nexus, N-E-X-U-S, write that down. If you're an out-of-state employee and you want to minimize your tax liability and maximize what you can put in your pocket at the end of the year, we're starting with this year, 2020, because if you're a remote employee, this might apply to you. Ask your tax specialist, ask your accountant, your CPA, whether or not there's a sufficient nexus between you and the company that's employed you. And they'll explain to you what that means. But basically, what that means is that if you're located in Florida and you're working for a California company, and that's part of your employee responsibilities, it's part of your obligations to be venued or living in Florida, but you're working in California, then that may impose one set of tax reporting requirements to you. Okay, if you ask your tax expert, is there a sufficient nexus for me with respect to this company, they'll explain to you what you need to know. And I would suggest doing this now, not waiting until next year. There may be some end of year planning you can do to help maximize your nexus arguments to minimize your tax liability. Many states are putting the nexus, many states and federal government regulations are putting the nexus requirement on hold so that there's no double taxation on your paychecks because of COVID-19. But not all states, in fact, just a few. So you want to check with your tax expert to make sure what state you're living in and how does it fall under this nexus argument to avoid double taxation. There's also what we call convenience employees. And convenience employees, that's another term you're going to want to discuss with your tax specialist. Are you a convenience employee? And what that means is, for example, if your company is in Los Angeles and you were living in Los Angeles, but because of COVID-19, you moved down to Orange County, about 60 miles south of Los Angeles, to live with your brother, your sister, to live with your mom and dad, to save some money, to stay safe, social distancing, right? You're making a convenience move. And that convenience move probably isn't going to affect your tax consequence. It's a convenience move that you undertook for convenience purposes. The same concept applies if you move from California to a different state. If it's a convenience move, then you need to talk to your tax expert about whether or not that convenience move harms or further burdens you when it comes to tax liability, or are there arguments that can be made that under the nexus or convenience classification will help benefit you when it comes to saving money and not having to pay as much in payroll taxes, withholdings, and things like this. So you want to just keep in mind the convenience employee definition and keep in mind the nexus employee definition, and run those by your tax specialist. Local labor laws, workman's compensation, unemployment insurance. If you're working for a California company, but you live in Texas, you live in New York, you live in Florida, for example, you're out of state, or you live out of the country, the next set of questions you need answered for you is to reach out to your employer. Excuse me, guys. Sorry about that. This is live. Like I said, this is kind of a last minute broadcast, but this is important stuff. Reach out to your employer and find out where they believe you stand. Okay. And this isn't about independent contracting. You're an employee with a company. Where do they stand when it comes to, are you covered under workman's compensation? Are you covered under unemployment insurance? Are you covered under local labor laws? And if so, is it in the state of California or is it in the state of Florida, to use our earlier example? You need to get your employer in writing to share with you what state, California or Florida, is going to cover your work comp, is going to cover your unemployment benefits, and which labor codes apply to help protect you as an employee. Is it California or is it Florida, for example? As an employer, you need to understand what the answers to these questions are as you start expanding your workforce across the country when it comes from work from anywhere employees. What state has determined it will be the primary state when it comes to interpreting and enforcing state laws under work comp, under unemployment benefits, and under certain labor code sections? Many lawyers believe that both states, where the employer is located and where the employee is located, will probably interplay with each other when it comes to one or more of these three categories. You want to find out the answer to these questions first before there's a workers' compensation claim, before there's an unemployed benefits claim, and before there's some type of finger pointing when it comes to the labor code. What I mean by that is a sexual discrimination type of charge, a wrongful termination type of case. Which state laws apply between you, the employer, and the employee? The employer being in California, the employee being out of state, for example, Florida. You want to find out what the answers to those questions are. These are new issues that really have come up prominently since COVID-19. There have been remote workers and workplace situations taking place, obviously for years, especially as technology, things like Zoom, things like Skype have progressed. But today, right now, everybody's focusing on working from home, working remotely, and we're seeing more and more CEOs in big companies hiring remote workforces. Okay, as a matter of fact, over 70% of CEOs have talked about they're able to find better quality employees and add value to their lives and have those employees add value to the company remotely, with these people working remotely. And so you got to get the answers to these questions, you guys, before you dive too far into the employer-employee relationship. The other thing you want to look at is, as you're building out this remote workforce, look at what's called the Research and Development Tax Credit. The Research and Development Tax Credit. And what this is all about is, I believe it's more than 2/3 of all large-scale companies are planning to formally downsize their office space, okay, and use remote workers. By tapping into the Research and Development Tax Credit program, it allows these companies to access tax incentives that will help reduce their business tax liability. And as an employee, there may be some benefits for you too. So whether you're an employer or an employee, talk to your tax specialist about the Research and Development Tax Credit and see how you can apply that to your company. Also, you need to pay attention to, both employers and employees, employee compensation. If you're not paying your employees to live in downtown LA, for example, it's expensive. There are a lot of different payment options with respect to housing, rent, food, transportation, that may not be applicable if that same employee, that same person that's occupying that position is working in Arizona or New York or in a rural area of Florida. And so as an employer, you need to take into consideration what are the different compensation approaches and packages that now might be more applicable to today's remote worker than what you were doing just 10, 12, 18, or 24 months ago, right? Super important that you wrap your head around what's a fair compensation package and what does compensation mean? We're not talking about just salary, okay? We're talking about retirement packages, non-monetary incentives. We're talking about the work comp benefits that we've earlier talked about. And the key with understanding how all of this works, whether you like it or not, is that what you decide to do here in California may not actually be legal for you to do with an Arizona or Florida employee. And that's why you as an employer, as you're rolling out these incentives and bonus packages and salary packages with your remote workers, you want to make sure you're complying, for example, with California law where your company is located, but you also want to make sure you're complying with the law of the state where your remote worker resides and is working from, and whether or not that outside state law applies to you as an employer in the state of California. Another and final topic, and this is key, you guys, and I see this happening all the time, is something that has to do with management and control of employees and how are you handling it as an employer. In the past, employees would come to work, they'd work their 8 hours and they'd go home, right? Now what we're seeing are remote workers basically on the computer 24/7, whether they want to be or not, or whether you want them to be or not as an employer, they're making themselves available by Zoom. They're making themselves available on the social media messaging platforms. They're making themselves available by text, by phone, and by email. And you need to understand that just because you can reach out and connect with your employees when you want to, you still have to comply with state labor laws. In other words, an employee is only allowed to work for so many hours in a particular state, right? And that depends on what type of employee you are and what you're doing for safety purposes. So you want to make sure that even though your employees are available and they're making themselves available, are you as an employer complying with state law? And once again, is it the law of the state that you're located in, or is this the law of the state where the employee is now living because they're working remotely? You're a California company, you hired a Florida employee that's working online. What state law applies? So talk to your tax specialist, talk to your in-house lawyers to get the answers to these questions. Employees generally have, and this is something that we're going to see more and more of, especially with remote workers, a right to disconnect. And so write that term down, right to disconnect. In the state that you have your company in, is there a right to disconnect law? Is it codified under the labor code? Is this something that's going to be developed through case law over time? The whole concept has to do with just because you've got someone available 24/7 in a Zoom, that doesn't mean they're an indentured servant to you. It means they're an employee, and the state labor law compliance requirements are still there. And you got to make sure you respect the ability of an employee as it either applies now or may apply in the future in your state, has a right to disconnect and basically have their personal life. So there's a new normal, you guys, when it comes to hiring employees, when it comes to working for a company. Physically, you may not ever need to be there again. I see the change that we've seen over the last 10 months. I see this continuing. We're more efficient. I think we're getting more done. I think it allows all of us to spend more time with our family, with our friends, not having to waste time commuting to work. But I also see employers and employees needing to wrap their minds around what are the new rules, what are the new regulations, and those are the talking points. So if you guys have any follow-up questions, I want you to ask them now in the comments. once again, what we've talked about in this video is we've talked about potential new tax filing requirements, both for the state where the employer, where the company's located, and the state where the remote worker resides or lives. We talked about research and development tax credits. What are those? Might they apply to your employment situation? We talked about different employee compensation packages and how that is going to change because of remote workers. Some of the benefits that were necessary for employees living in expensive cities and traveling and eating in expensive cities no longer exist because they're working remotely. So what is an employer going to have to do to stay competitive? What can a remote employee expect or negotiate into their employment relationship with the employer? And once again, I think it comes down to retirement packages. It comes down to non-merit monetary incentives. It comes down to work comp, health insurance, and depending on the company you're working for, stock options and things like that. Remember and write down these three terms when you talk to a specialist. You want to talk about whether or not your hire creates a nexus, N-E-X-U-S, relationship between you and your employee, or if you're an employee, between you and your employer. Write down nexus. You want to talk to your tax specialist about that. You want to talk to your tax specialist about the convenience rule. Does that apply to you? And we've talked about this earlier in the show. And you also want to talk to your HR department, both if you're an employer, talk to your HR department. If you're an employee, talk to your HR department about where your rights are when it comes to the right to disconnect in your state. Is there a right? Is that something that's developing with both case law and new legislative laws? Is that something that's already been taken into consideration when it comes to your employer-employee relationship? And I think what you'll find is when you take all of this together and get answers to these questions between now and the end of the year, understand what your filing requirements are, both as an employer when dealing with remote workers and as an employee when you are a remote worker. Do you have to file in both states? Do you have to file in just one state? What are the rules as they apply to you? Couple that with what we've already talked about, and I think you'll be in good shape when it comes to moving forward as a remote worker and as a company hiring remote workers moving forward through the end of 2020 and into 2021 and beyond. If you guys have any questions, I can refer you to good employer-employee law firms, friends of mine. This is what they specialize in. I just know enough about this stuff to get myself in trouble, but I do know these are the issues and the talking points right now that are being discussed and that both employers and employees need to know more about. And now you also are up to speed on the important terms and the important issues that you need to get answers to. All right, you guys, connect with me over at streaming.lawyer. My name is Mitch Jackson. You can connect with me on all of the social platforms, and definitely hop over to human.social if you want to check out my live video show where I interview amazing people from around the world that are disrupting industries and creating change. Between now and the next show, you guys take care, enjoy the journey, and make each day your masterpiece. Bye-bye.